Hi, and welcome to another edition of Critical Q&A, the show where I answer your questions based on what you've left for me in the comments section, or by email at askchrisshelton@gmail.com. This is our 21st episode, and we're just rolling them out here. I got a lot of questions, so we're just going to get right to it. Zeka. Thank you so very much for your important and interesting videos. My question is, I heard that the OT courses consist of the attendee just being delivered a number of documents to read, handwritten by LRH. So, for X thousands of dollars, they just sit there and read a couple of pages that they then have to give back? Is that true? If so, couldn't the absurdity of the situation rather be seen as a test about the status of indoctrination? Or are the OT courses in a classroom situation with one or more attendees and a tutor? Would you describe this? Thank you very much. And Viel liebe Grüße from Germany. That is the one and only time I will ever attempt to speak German. This is actually, thank you for this question, this is actually completely not how OT courses or the advanced courses in Scientology are delivered, so I thought I would take this up. The advanced levels of Scientology are audited. There's counseling, but it's a solo thing, so you can't really call it counseling because nobody's counseling with you. You're just doing it to yourself, so it's called solo auditing. And the courses are just the part that train you in how to do the specific auditing procedures for each OT level. So right now there are 8 OT levels, and all of them except OT4 and OT5 are done solo, which means you sit at a desk with an e-meter and there are specific commands that you use, and you hold the cans in your hand and you sit there and watch the meter and you run a series of questions or commands or processes on yourself, which are all over the internet, so I'm not going to sit here and say what all the commands are, but you do those to yourself silently in this room following these procedures that you've learned in doing the OT courses. And so Hubbard called them OT courses or the advanced courses, and that's why it might sound confusing, might make it sound like they're just a class that you take, but they're not. The class is just the first part, then there's the solo auditing. And as far as all of it being in Hubbard's handwriting, that's not true either. There's only a couple of issues on the OT courses that are handwritten, like the Xenu pages, which is a few pages of reference. Most of the references are typed out in issue form, and those are in what are called HCOBs, or Hubbard Communications Office Bulletins, which is how most of the technology of Dianetics and Scientology is laid out, is it's in these bulletins. And there's just books and books of these things. But on the OT courses, that's all confidential material, and so you only see those bulletins on those advanced OT courses. So each level has its own procedures and its own methods and processes that you do, and that's what you spend time in the course room or in the classroom learning. And it consists of reading how to do it, and then you drill or practice doing it, and then you actually go and do the procedure. And there's not a teacher, but there's a course supervisor who oversees the classes and makes sure that everybody gets it. And the classroom could have 15, 20, 2 students in it. And it's sort of a study at your own pace. Everybody's going at their own pace through the materials. It's not a classroom situation where there's a tutor or a class teacher or something like that. And that's the same with all Scientology classes. So if you have questions about that, that's a whole nother question. And that material is all available at the tip of your fingers with Google. So that's how OT levels are delivered, and the bulk of the levels are done solo audited, and that's where you spend hours and hours and hours and hours. The courses usually take anywhere from 15 to 90 hours of coursework, depending on which level. I think OT2 is one of the bigger ones. There are also, just for informational sake, since most people don't know this, there are films on OT2. I don't think there's films on the other levels that are specific confidential films for the OT levels, but on OT2, There are, and I think there's either, I can't remember if it's 9 or 11 films that are just made for that level, and sorry, they are given at another level too, but I'm not going to get into explaining all the niceties of that. There's just, on OT2, there are these films, and that's Hubbard explaining some of the OT material and the stuff about the BTs and the stuff about, you know, the whole track and stuff like that. And you can't see those films anywhere else except on that level. They've never been released anywhere else. They're not on the internet. And, you know, so wish they were. I never saw them. I'd love to see them just for, you know, silly sake. So that's how the OT levels are delivered. Matt Kordelsky. When you were in Scientology, did you or any of your fellow members ever ask why L. Ron Hubbard would drop into that strange faux Boston accent for certain words, then back to his regular voice for the rest of the sentence? Galactic ruler, colossal 3D motion picture. He said galaxy as galaxy. Was this part of his brainwashing, trying to make himself seem smarter and more sophisticated? I don't think it was part of his brainwashing, but it might have been him trying to sound a bit smarter or more sophisticated than he actually was. And personally, it used to drive me crazy when I was in, because I couldn't figure out why he would say these words this way. You know, galaxy. Who says galaxy? That's, to me, it was like, you know, the British saying aluminium. You know, it's like, no, dude, it's aluminum. So anyway, I don't know why he pronounced things that way, except that it was his upbringing, or that's how he learned how to say those words, but that's how he did it. MDW. There seems to be the idea on the underground bunker that Scientology is excessively puritanical on sex, to the point where they wonder why Jenna and Bodhi Elfman wouldn't be sent to ethics for talking about their sex life on YouTube. But my memory from the late 1970s was that other than Hubbard's comments that homosexuals were 1.1 and that Sea Org members were not supposed to have sex before marriage, my impression was that Scientology tended to be sexually free. What changes to attitudes towards sexuality did you observe during the years you were involved with Scientology? Well, this is actually a pretty big question, but and I'm not going to go into the Encyclopedia Britannica answer. There were changes made because in the early 1980s there was a bulletin laid out called Pain and Sex, where Hubbard basically said that sex was totally artificial and was used in a very destructive fashion over the millennia, and that it was really not a very good thing. And he even said at the beginning of the issue that this issue is not going to increase my popularity at all, but you know, it's research information, so I have to give it out, and you know, yeah, whatever, dude. So anyway, Pain and Sex is used as a bulletin a lot in Scientology to repress and suppress sexual feelings and sexual desires and urges. And there's also a thing about masturbation in one of the early books. I think it's Creation of Human Ability, where he talks about how it's something that is that a person, when they're masturbating, will create pictures. They'll fantasize, and Hubbard said that in doing that, they'll tend to make the reactive mind, or the bank, more stronger. They beef it up, and so masturbation's you know, is somewhat of a destructive activity. Although he never said the word destructive, as I recall, in talking about it. It was later that came down, and just about any guy who ever masturbates, you know, if you're gonna, in Scientology, when that comes up, you're gonna end up reading this business from Creation of Human Ability, and you're gonna end up reading Pain and Sex, and these are gonna be drummed into you with such force that you get the idea that you know, sex is just a really bad thing. So I understand that started with Miscavige more so than Hubbard, though. But I can't really tell. You know, I wasn't around in the 60s and 70s, so I can't say for sure what the attitude about it was, except I know it was a lot more open, a lot freer. But I know that come 1980s, and especially into the 90s, word came down that, you know, sex was like verboten for Sea Org members, and of course that attitude on the Sea Org clergy, on the Sea Org, would then filter down to the staff and to the public, because, you know, if you have a core of people who consider that there's something wrong with sex, or that sex is something that is supposed to be regulated, then they're going to regulate it on down the line as they see fit, and so it's become a much more controlled thing. And of course, as we know from history, when you start regulating sex and sexual urges and sexual behavior, you have all manner of trouble start, because people have, very strong urges, and when you say no, that's bad, then you're creating some mental, psychological problems for people, and that leads to, all kinds of messes. M.B. Blover. How do you feel when others question you with, "Who are you that we should listen to you? What makes you right? Why should we believe everything you say?" Also, how do you feel when those still in or defenders of the cult, including the celebs, say you are lying and are only doing this to make a buck? Well, my attitude is that I don't want anybody listening to me thinking that everything I say is right and isn't to be questioned, and who am I? I'm just another guy, and I've never really said anything otherwise. I don't have any letters after my name. I'm not like some big doctored person or something like that. My effort to speak out against Scientology and to talk about critical thinking and anything else I'm talking about is just Chris Shelton talking. And I certainly have my experience and my background, and I like to think I have some pretty good opinions about things, but I'm putting this out there 100% take it or leave it. And in fact, with critical thinking, I would very much encourage that people have a take it or leave it attitude with the things that I'm saying, and corroborate, check out other references, other sources, other things that people say, because there are lots of other people out there that have lots of other very valid things to say. So that's my sort of take on that. And have I made bad life choices in the past? Of course I have. Who hasn't? So, if that's going to become a big judgment factor as to, whether you can take anything I say, well, I think that's kind of not very critical thinking, because, anybody can have something valid to say, regardless of whether they've, screwed up in the past or not. And I like to think that having screwed up and having seen the error of my ways and having gotten myself extricated from that all on my own, that might, give me a little bit of credibility all by itself too. So there is that. Now, as far as, people in the cult talking about me or critics of Scientology, I don't give any credence to that, because they're still trapped in a cult mindset. And I know exactly what that means, and exactly how that feels, and exactly what it does to you. And, I'm not down on people for their beliefs and stuff. I've made that clear. But I'm not going to give any credence to somebody who is living in a world of lies, surrounded by cognitive dissonance and irrationality, who believes some of the most illogical pseudoscientific nonsense that you can ever dream up. And that is my description of Scientology, of course. I'm not going to take that person's criticism of me very personally, because I've been there, done that, and I've done that criticizing that they are doing, and I know how valid it is, and it's not valid. So I don't give any credence to that. And as far as me doing this only to make a buck, I'm not doing this only to make a buck. I am trying to make a living through my YouTube channel and through my speaking and writing and whatnot that I do, and that's a long process. And I'm not there yet, and we'll see if I ever get there. But I'm not trying to cash in on my Scientology experiences or something. I'm trying to do exactly what I said I'm trying to do, which is help people out and warn people about the dangers of destructive cults. So that's my attitude about the whole thing. Logamug. Dear Chris, when it comes to filtering information in everyday life, the application of skeptical analysis is not too great a burden. However, what are we to do with complex issues which, to address fairly, would require years of reading and analysis in order to affirm or negate the ideas presented to you, such as Aristotelian metaphysics or Kantian ontology, etc.? These notions are clearly not intentionally deceptive or clearly false. However, I find myself not wholly convinced despite being unable to provide adequate counter-argument. Since I lack the motivation and time to work through tomes of dry and convoluted texts and commentary, am I therefore being an irrational and non-critical thinker? How are we to deal with these situations? That's actually a really great question. And, my approach to critical thinking is to be very, very practical, very, very common sense, and very true to life. I'm not interested in going through big, huge German tomes of difficult to read epistemology and ontology and these kind of things. I don't even know what that word means, and I'm not frankly interested in finding out right now. Maybe at some point I will, but right now my level of understanding of this stuff is pretty, pedestrian, pretty common sense. And I'm not trying to go too much deeper into it. I think that if we apply our faculties, our intelligence to our life and the things that we are faced with in terms of things that come out of politicians' mouths or the media or, destructive cults or religion or any of these things, I think if we just apply ourselves and remember to apply ourselves and remember to think and realize that thinking is not a part-time activity, I think if we just did that much, we would be leaps and bounds ahead of where, unfortunately, so many of us are at now, being inundated with, advertising and just waves and waves of nonsense in social media and otherwise, and we become lazy thinkers. And I don't want to try to make everybody into a philosophy major or, a critical thinker with a PhD. That's not what I think is needed in order to make the world a better place. I think that we all just need to not be lazy thinkers and be a little bit more active when it comes to looking at and thinking about the issues that we're confronted with, and take a little bit of time. It doesn't really take a lot. Once you get into the habit of it and you start doing it a little bit more routinely, you find out that it doesn't take a lot to get yourself informed on both sides or all sides of an issue. It takes a little bit of time, and it can't be done by just perusing the headlines on your Facebook page or on MSNBC or by listening to one or two talking heads. It takes more than that, but the investment is worth the time because you come out knowing and being a lot more sure about what's going on in the world around you. And that's what I use critical thinking for, and that's what I'm trying to encourage other people to do. And when you, the other side effect of this, or the other good result of this, is that the more you do this, not just with current events, but with things like, groups you're a part of, religions, political groups, social groups, whatever, the more you do this, the easier it becomes, and the more well-rounded your views of things become in the real world, so that you don't get so easily fooled and so easily deceived or fall into the traps that are laid by these groups who frankly, some of them are trying to deceive you or purposefully alter or mess with the information that they give you so that you do come out with only one side of a picture as slanted, skewed views and things like that. And end up, a lot of the intolerance, a lot of the violence, a lot of the upset that goes on in people's lives comes from the fact that they are operating on very skewed information. So just take a little bit more time to find out a little bit more about the world around you and what's actually going on, and life gets a lot more calm, a lot chiller. Laura S. Laura Soros. How were Scientologists affected by 9/11? At that time, I had been confirmed a Catholic as an adult. Although we always seemed to fill up the church, all the masses were literally packed after 9/11. Did you see any change in the amount of new members? Or did you lose people? Or did it barely affect them, considering the organization deliberately cut themselves off from the rest of the country? Did they believe the psychs were behind it? It's an interesting question. There actually was an issue that was put out by David Miscavige the day after 9/11 happened called The Wake Up Call. And maybe I'll post a screenshot of this. But it was an issue that was basically a call to arms for all Scientologists. And Miscavige said, the long and short of his message was, wake the hell up. We don't have an infinity of time to get the planet cleared using Scientology. In other words, we need to get Scientology to the masses, and we need to do it now. And then he gave two instructions, or two things to do for everybody. One, get themselves up the bridge, and two, participate more and contribute to pulling off the big win, as I think is how he put it. And that was very disappointing for a lot of us Sea Org members, sort of covertly disappointing. In other words, we didn't sit around talking about it, but we were frustrated because we wanted people joining staff. We wanted people becoming part of the movement by becoming staff members, because if there's one thing, Scientology cannot do is it can't do all the things it's trying to do or wants to do, because it doesn't have enough people to do it. It's always suffered from too few people. This millions of members thing, I knew that was nonsense when I was in. So we kind of were hoping that Miscavige would actually lay down the gauntlet and go like, look, it's time to, put up or shut up, get on staff, right? And a lot of people were recruited onto staff using that issue, but it wasn't a command, and we really wanted that command from Miscavige because, of course, we followed his commands, so everybody else should too. Anyway, as far as public participation or more participation or anything like that, yeah, a little bit. There was a little bit, but it wasn't like the churches were packed, and it wasn't like floods of people came into Scientology. And in fact, within a couple weeks, it was back to business as usual. It was just a big yawn. And there was a lot of frustration within the Sea Org about this. I remember clearly, I was in Los Angeles, and I remember Guillaume Lesève, ED International at the time, the French guy, who used to be out on stage at events. He said, or at least I heard he said, in frustration one day because the statistics were not doing so well, he said, what do these people in LA need? Do they need an airplane to fly into the Hollywood sign? Like, what is this? He was so frustrated about the fact that Scientologists were just sort of taking the whole thing with a big yawn. So there really wasn't much of a response to 9/11. And shortly thereafter, it was just back to business as usual with Scientology. Darth Xenu. I know that each church keeps an office for Hubbard in case he returns, and considering Hubbard's revelation in OT8 that he will fulfill the role of the biblical Antichrist, how do upper-level Scientologists see their version of end times playing out? Do you think they are looking for this person who would be the beast of Revelations? And considering the underground vaults storing, preserving the entirety of Scientological materials, would you say they expect or would even work to facilitate an apocalyptic event? I know this is some pretty deep shit, but I would really appreciate if you could address this aspect of their teachings that no one ever seems to mention. Okay, well, first thing I want to correct on this question actually straight away is there's kind of this idea that goes on with people who were never in Scientology that all the things that you know because you've read it on the internet are the same things as what the people in Scientology know. And they are not. And they are so much not that you can get a very skewed idea of what actually goes on in the bubble world of Scientology if you think that all the things you read about on the internet are common knowledge amongst Scientologists. Xenu story, for example, and I think I mentioned this in my last episode, like 1% of Scientologists know about the Xenu story. The rest of Scientology is utterly clueless about it. They have no idea what you're talking about when you start talking about Xenu. It's even more so with this question in regards to the OT8 bulletin, where Hubbard talks about himself being Lucifer and the bringer of light and this whole thing. And also, I think this issue is also a bit misunderstood, but I'm not going to get into that right now. As I understand it, there have been 3 versions of OT8, and this bulletin that Hubbard talks about himself being Lucifer was only in the very first version of it, and they pulled it shortly thereafter. So not only are we talking about 1% of Scientologists know about Xenu, well, 1% of that 1% knows about this issue where Hubbard talked about himself being Lucifer. No one else in Scientology is aware of this. So you're asking me a question about literally a handful of people in Scientology. Now, that being clarified, I'll answer the question more broadly as to what do Scientologists think about in terms of end of days and that sort of thing. And factually, they don't really think about it too much. You know, they think that that they need to move faster, do more. They're constantly pushed for getting more money in because the world's clearly going to hell in a handbasket, according to the International Association of Scientologists and all the briefings they get, and they're told all the bad news of everything horrible that's going on in the world, and all of that is given to them so that they'll give more money. But there's no end game in sight where there's a plan. There is no plan in Scientology, in the bubble world, for what happens if there's a nuclear war tomorrow. What happens if World War III starts tomorrow? There's nothing. And they don't talk about it amongst themselves much. At least they didn't any time I was ever around in the 27 years I was in. We just sort of did this, you know, just sort of, yeah, you know, we got to move faster, we got to work harder because things are bad. But there is no plan. And there certainly isn't anybody in Scientology who's trying to bring about the end of the world because they have some idea that that would be a good thing. That is just not true at all. Nobody in Scientology is wanting the civilization to collapse and fall apart, and nobody in Scientology wants the preservation of the tech projects, those vaults with all the materials, you know, written in metal plates. Nobody wants a scenario where those things have to be brought out and used because civilization is tanked. That's the last thing anybody in Scientology wants. Remember, most Scientologists are rich, affluent white people, and they are not the kind of people who want to, you know, they're not survivor types. So, you know, in other words, survivalists who have underground compounds and, you know, out in the, you know, desert of Utah or the forests of Montana or something. That's not your Scientologists. So that's kind of, I guess, what I could say about that. Melissa Brooklyn. Did you have career goals while in the church? If so, what was your motivation to further these goals, the church, personal, or a combination? Thank you for your videos. I look forward to them each week. When I first got into Scientology and joined staff, I wanted to be an educator, a course supervisor, and they convinced me to join staff because they said that they would train me in order to be the best course supervisor or teacher, educator that was in Scientology. I was going to be among the best of the best, and that was the reason why I joined up in the first place. I had the idea that I wanted to be a writer from school, and I was going to go to college and I was going to be an English teacher and be a writer. That was my career path before I joined staff. So when I joined staff, that kind of the idea of being an educator sort of fit with that on that line. Then as I progressed in Scientology and then I eventually joined the Sea Organization, I went into management and I did that for a number of years until I kind of tanked, as I've talked about before. And then I went to the RPF. And while I was on the RPF, I decided that I wanted to be an auditor, like really bad. And up until that point, I hadn't really done much with the Scientology counseling as far as auditing others. I'd done a bit, but not a lot. And it really appealed to me because you do a lot of auditing when you're on the RPF. And it was something that I thought I was helping other people with. I thought it was constructive activity. And so that was what I wanted to do. But Scientology being Scientology, when I got off the RPF, instead, I was sent to go make books. So I did that for like 9 months, and I absolutely hated it. And then I kind of finagled my way over to doing recruitment and recruiting people into the Sea Org, and I was pretty good at it. And then I got into doing recoveries, where I was recovering people who had blown off and left Scientology, and I was going out and calling them and going to their houses and getting them back in, and I was pretty good at that. Until I, through the course of doing those two things, recruitment and recovery, I saw the darker side of Scientology, like up close and personal, and realized that I was part of something not so great. I started getting the idea when it was clear to me that I wasn't going to be able to be an auditor, that maybe I could get into graphic design or stuff like that. I found I had a kind of a penchant for that. I liked doing it. And I thought maybe I could get into that, but I realized because I was good at recruitment and because I was good at recovery and good at helping orgs out, that I was never going to be allowed to just go have a desk job like that. And so I decided that was one of the things that made me realize and decide that I needed to leave the Sea Org. And of course, after that, I ended up leaving Scientology altogether. So those were kind of my career-minded ideas when I was involved. And with that, we come to the end of another Critical Q&A episode. I hope you found these questions as interesting as I did. And I really appreciate your comments, your questions, your feedback. So keep it coming in. Just put them in the comments section of this video, and I will see them. And by the way, if you've asked me questions, even if you've asked me questions a couple months ago, and I haven't gotten to them yet, it's not necessarily that I don't have them. I've got a list of over 200 questions to go through and answer, and each week I have to go through and pull them out. And so the process is totally arbitrary, really, on my part. But if you really have a burning need to get your question answered, and I haven't gotten around to it yet, just send it to me again. You can email it to me at askchrisshelton@gmail.com, and I will do my best to get to them as quickly as I can. So you feel that there's value from what I'm doing here, please throw some support my way or become part of my Patreon campaign. That is the long-term support for me and something that I'm very much trying to make happen so that I can take my channel to the next level. Thank you for watching.